The left is winning, where it matters. Right triumphalism misunderstands the very nature of the left. Bruce Charlton. People who regard themselves as of the right are displaying an insane and blinkered optimism that they are winning, and rolling back leftism. This is because they do not understand what the left is, in its fundamental nature. If they did understand, those who proclaim themselves of the right would realize that they are merely functioning as a subtype of the left. The political right supposes that the left is an ideology rooted in some principles. They believe that the left is these policies that I call the litmus tests. I mean things like socialism, feminism, anti-racism, anti-Semitism, the climate agenda. In general terms, the self-identified right define the left in terms of political correctness, SJWs, wokeness, and their manifestations in the mass media, law, employment regulations, etc. Because they suppose that the left is an ideology of wokeness, the right imagine that reversals of specific social practices and regulations represent a rolling back of leftism in their nation, or in the world. When the right sees laws, fundings, rhetoric being undone, they think the left is being defeated. But this is completely wrong, because the left is a negative ideology, an ideology of opposition, and none of the litmus tests are core features of leftism. They might all, in principle, be undone and the left still be as strong as ever. All the left ideologies are negative in form. The left is, in various times and places, against many things: capitalism, the bourgeoisie, inequality, patriarchy, European people, Christians, but is not in favor of any state of affairs as an ultimate and real goal. In other words, the left is protean in nature, fluid, adapting. It is continually discarding old ideologies and taking up new ones. The left used to be in favor of economic communism, but not anymore, in favor of native-born male industrial workers, the working class, but not anymore, in favor of equality of opportunities and unequal outcomes, but not anymore. Leftism can and does discard anything that is currently inexpedient, because there are an endless number of alternatives. And there is in fact no coherent thing as the right, because the right is merely opposition to the various leftist oppositions. Leftist ideology is double negative, I against what they currently regard as bad things, though the right is a triple negation, I against those who are against what the left currently calls bad things. No wonder those endless essays striving to define the right never gets anywhere. This is why the right is so wrong about the rolling back of leftism. It supposes that the left abandoning some of its recent woke agenda represents some kind of a defeat, but it is just the usual slippery shape shifting of leftism, which now has other priorities, especially war. Since leftism is fundamentally oppositional and negative, leftism is essentially destructive. War is very destructive, hence World War is perhaps an ultimate expression of leftism. And it matters nothing that pacifism, anti-war, anti-violence, was one of the original roots of leftism, from more than 200 years ago. War can give leftism everything and more of whatever losses it may suffer from dropping a few strands of political correctness. Just look at what the leaders of Western nations are actually doing, where they are putting most of their effort. They are in practice, not in what they say, but in what they do over time, angling for more war. Not to win a war, but for the maximizing the destruction of war, destruction of economies, societies, trade, positive national identities of nature, aka the environment, expansion of such negations as lies, resentment, and despair. We are, and have been for a few years, seeing more and more wars, and what war brings. Expanding and escalating the already existing world war with its multiple fronts, but especially in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. We can see the globalist, totalitarian leadership class at work engineering wars all over the place, recently on the Asian subcontinent. This isn't easy to do. There are plenty of people who don't want war, for obvious reasons. But that is what they are serious about. Ultimately, of course, politics is downstream of the spiritual war of this world. Leftism is a tool of evil in its opposition to God and divine creation. Yes, the sexual revolution was and is a deadly tool of corruption, but a self-righteous and hate-driven war of each against all would be deadlier still. When the right celebrates a few small victories, many of which turn out to mere words, and no substantive change, they miss that the left now has bigger fish to fry, and other things it cares much more about. The woke agenda might be forgotten as thoroughly as the days, a century ago, when white European men were the left's heroes, but the left is continuing to win, and win where it matters most. And this will continue until those on the right recognize that they are part of the problem, and repent. AI is strategically about destruction, not control. Francis Berger's post, Laeth's comment. Bruce Charlton. Following an insightful post on AI by Francis Berger, in the comments, Laeth produced a simple and convincing reconceptualization of what lies behind this global strategy. I have edited this excerpt. Imonic refers to a type of totalitarian/bureaucratic/systemic evil, that is materialistic in assumptions and seeks omni-surveillance and thought control. Sorithic refers to a more advanced, negative, and purely destructive evil, that is motivated a spiteful hatred of humans, life, and all manifestations of divine creation. Laeth's comment, edited.
When all this started, my intuition was that the diabolic element here was mostly Ahrimanic, that is, the objective was pure control. But more and more I think I was wrong about this, even if Ahrimanic forces were channeled to bring it to fruition. It seems more likely to me now that AI is actually pure Sorithic envious evil. A big fraud at all levels that won't really even be useful for control, only to debase and destroy everything, from its enormous consumption of earthly energy for its functioning to the consumption of human energy from the engagement of people. An all-consuming strategy, really. I try to avoid even seeing anything of AI or about it. I even try to avoid speaking too much against it, because I fear that too is me being sucked into its web. But it's now impossible to not find it, it's everywhere. Even normal, and older, people, have started to talk about it, and in the exact terms the system wants them to. Yet even my tangential acquaintance with AI is enough to see that it's terrible at its purported higher objectives. It will just jumble up things with no direction, no purpose and no coherence, and any minimally intelligent person can understand that it's all nonsense. It cannot manage anything. If given any power to manage a system, AI will just run it to the ground, and I see now that at its goal. To destroy any possibility of management, while consuming every possible resource that could be used to correct it. I think Armin was tricked too, in other words. Full Sorithic destruction is its only route and possibility of it.
My comment, this immediately struck me as correct. The globalist, totalitarian establishment, who sustain the system is being lied to and tricked into the trillions-dollar project of AI, by demonic beings whose purpose includes the destruction of the system. Once pointed out, but it needed pointing out, the strategy seems clear. Because, given the actuality of AI, of what it is, of how it works, this is the only possible outcome of widespread usage of, and therefore inevitable dependence upon, so-called AI. AI is a kind of mind virus that has been introduced into the consciousness of managers, at almost every level, from national and multinational leaders down to the multitudes of middling myrmidons. In the immediate short term, all the institutional incentives are lined up to focus upon introducing and developing and expanding AI, regardless of its effect on institutional functionality. But in the medium to long term, AI will destroy management itself, in a very direct fashion, along with institutional functionality. So the mind virus of AI functions like an addictive drug that rewards its user by short-term euphoria, at the cost of actively killing the user. My reading of Western social trends is that the Sorithic agenda has been gaining ground since the summer of 2020, when the ironic totalitarian global triumph of the Birdemic coup, with its international lockdowns, began to yield to the intrinsically socially destructive policies of combining multivalent institutional anti-racism with a renewal and acceleration of mass immigration. Since 2020, the Sorothic destructive agenda has been doubled down on by those who control the Western leadership class. Especially, it has caused /sustained/escalated war in Eastern Europe, then rolled out to the Middle East, now, being attempted, in South Asia, also elsewhere. All this gratuitous and self-annihilating destruction, e.g. sanctions that damage the sanctioner more than the sanctioned, is sold to the managerial classes of the world as assisting their globalist totalitarian goals, Great Reset, Agenda 2030 etc. They are told that inducing societal chaos will create a desire for order, and thereby facilitate a further coup, on top of the successful early 2020 Birdemic coup, to enable a stable and lasting dictatorship of the left. Yet this was never possible, because the materialist leftist ideology of the totalitarians is intrinsically negative, oppositional, hence destructive. Even in its earliest and partly good manifestations, leftism always had Sorothic evil as its secret master. This canker of the heart was evident in that, whenever totalitarian control was, briefly, established, it was inevitably followed by accelerating disorder and destruction. While there is an almost irresistible schadenfreude induced by watching the managerial state enthusiastically implementing that self-destruct button which is AI, observers need to be mindful that evil does not cancel out. As totalitarianism is destroyed by spiteful sadism, the process yields no increase in net good in the world. Good comes from recognizing what is going on in the spiritual war of this world, rejecting it inwardly, i.e. repenting our complicity, and then spiritually affiliating to God and divine creation, by following Jesus Christ, to that salvation which is resurrected eternal heavenly life. Why do premortal spirits, such as you and me, choose to incarnate mortally? Why don't we stay as spirit beings? Bruce Charlton. From the metaphysical assumptions of many religious conceptualizations, it is hard to imagine why anyone would want to incarnate as a mortal, for example, an embodied human being, given all the intrinsic problems, as well as the possible risks. Why wouldn't spirits want to stay as spirits? Stay safe and sound. But if entropy is an inescapable reality in God's first creation, then the alternative to incarnation is inevitable decay, the inexorable loss of whatever we gain in terms of memories, of learning from experiences. It seems that spirit beings change more slowly than incarnated mortals, but presumably they do change, and in primary creation there is no escape. So spirits are not really safe and sound, at least not in terms of staying who they are. Spirit beings are immortal, and divine creation will continually give life, vitality, healing, growth and so forth. But this cannot be cumulative, all created spirit beings will continually be losing themselves, even as they are being remade. Just as things are for us now, here on earth. I understand incarnation to be a concentration. The spiritual is primary, and all the material/physical world is spiritual, yet an embodied being is like a concentrated spirit, one in which things are more focused, change more rapid, and most importantly where the self is more bounded, hence more free. Incarnated beings are more themselves, for better and worse, than the same beings as a spirit. We are more differentiated from other beings than our spirits, hence we can, in principle, understand more clearly, make personal choices, and see the basis for personal responsibility. So, if you are a premortal spirit, you are faced with the prospect of inevitable change and loss of self, or else you can choose to take the risk and incarnate in hope that you will choose to move on to the second creation, to resurrected eternal life, or heaven, as described by Jesus Christ, a place and state where entropy is permanently escaped. This happens, I have argued, because entropy arises from incomplete love between beings, in the second creation we permanently commit to live by love. 'Tis mortal incarnated life is intrinsically an adventure, where we can succeed or fail, but where success or failure is a matter of free choice. It seems that some people who have incarnated as mortal men, most people perhaps, take a look at the second creation, think about it, and then reject it, preferring something else. But whatever something else is preferred to heaven, and whatever its advantages in the short term, it will entail continual loss of self. The being that inhabits somewhere other than heaven will, over the long term, lose memory, lose the effects of experiences, lose its distinctive identity, will fade. Out with heaven, beings do not die, because beings are eternal, but they will always be tending to revert to that primal chaos of indifference, of simply existing. Yet to escape this fate, to have everlasting, cumulative personal life as ourselves, entails living wholly by love, and it seems that only some people want to live forever on those terms. Soul loss. William Wildblood. The well-known Alice Bailey books are a development of theosophy, though with greater emphasis on Christ than Blavatskyan theosophy, even if he is still not the Christ that Christians know but a kind of grand hierarch. But then, since the assumed source of these books is Buddhist, that might be expected. Also, we must remember that theosophists were often reacting against the 19th century version of Christ, a time when he was well on his way to his conversion to humanitarianism, and starting to lose his purely spiritual qualities. So, when they downgraded Christ, that may have been part of an attempt not to be bound by the developing materialism of Victorian Christianity. That admittedly large failing aside, by most other criteria these books are impressive. Their sheer volume for one. Then their wisdom. Yes, I do think there is much spiritual wisdom in them, though that doesn't mean I agree with all that is there. I also think they come from a reputable spiritual source, though I would guess that there is a fair amount of Alice Bailey and her own ideas in there too. Maybe she was impressed on a non-verbal level and clothed the ideas in her own words. Or something along those lines. But there is a happy medium between complete acceptance of these writings on their own terms and total rejection. I accept what makes sense, and a lot does, reserve judgment on what seems to me to be doubtful, and reject what I think is wrong. I haven't looked at the books for a long time, and I'm not sure I've ever read one all the way through, certainly not a treatise on cosmic fire. But using the index to pick and choose was a helpful way to approach them for me, and the compilations that condense the several thousand pages to manageable proportions are also useful. I bring this up because in a recent comment on Bruce Charlton's blog in response to a post on AI, I wrote that the real basis behind all these developments, in AI and computer technology in general, is spiritual destruction, going beyond mere atheism up to and including the destruction of the spiritual component of our being, which I believe is possible when we reach the point that we totally deny all that spirit is. My point was that for a long time many developments in technology and thought have supported the denial of the soul, the aforementioned spiritual component of our being. AI is the latest and most serious. Every time we get on board with one of these developments, all the way from simply not rejecting it to accepting it gladly as a real advance, we play into the hands of the forces of spiritual destruction. To a certain extent, it doesn't matter if we think we don't believe in God as long as we act, both mentally and in day-to-day life, as though there was some kind of spiritual reality to our being. For example, we might revere beauty or believe in free will. These are something, though probably not enough. But they are something. But every step we take away from the soul, and embracing AI is a giant step in that direction, the more we lose contact with what it stands for, and the more we do that, the closer we are to severing our connection to it completely. To losing our soul. After I wrote my comment, I was reminded of something in the Alice Bailey books, so I looked it up. Here's what she says. It actually comes from a treatise on cosmic fire, though I took it from the soul, the quality of life, which is one of the compilations I spoke of above. I've edited it slightly. If man neglects his spiritual development and concentrates on intellectual effort turned to the manipulation of matter for selfish ends, and if this is carried on for a long period, he may bring upon himself a destruction that is final for this cycle. He may succeed in the complete destruction of the physical permanent atom and sever his connection with the higher self for eons of time. We must emphasize the reality of this dire disaster. This warning comes in the context of discussing occult work and saying it must be undertaken in the light of spirit and guided by love and unselfishness. Consequently, it might be considered irrelevant in terms of the current scenario. But I would maintain that computer technology is a form of magic, and its development is motivated by the same ungodly impulses that motivated the Black Magician. Any attempt to bend matter to our will that is not guided by spirit is illicit. By the same token, any behavior that denies the soul is selfish, which may be an unusual definition but is true on a deeper level than the normal one. From a spiritual perspective, selfishness is acting according to the earthly self, even if the earthly self considers itself to be spiritually motivated, a common phenomenon. That aside, the more we deny spirit, and AI is the denial of spirit almost by definition, the more we cut ourselves off from it, and there may come a time when certain people who go all the way into this dark place cut themselves off entirely. The tragedy of the modern world is that the whole culture is sending us in that direction. Oxtail soup, steak and kidney pie, tapioca pudding, sardines. Bruce Charlton. What did they do with the rest of the ox? Why do I get to eat its tail? Several of the common and everyday foods of my childhood, things I would be served almost every week, like it or not, have all but disappeared. These are many, and include canned oxtail soup, steak and kidney pies, tapioca pudding and tins of sardines. I'm not sorry to see the back of any of these. The flavor of oxtail soup always seemed a bit odd to me, with an unpleasant aftertaste. I never could understand why anyone would want to ruin a steak pie with bits of rubbery, urinous kidney. Tapioca pudding was bland belly timber. Sardines were okay, as small fish go, certainly better than the vile pilchards, but I never really miss them. I classify all of these as wartime foods, which were imposed on British people by the shortages and distortions created by totalitarianism, i.e. the combination of a U-boat blockade, and the ignorant tyranny of the Ministry of Agriculture. I think the bad reputation of British food came from this era. The socialistic national government, then the ruling Labour Party, loved being able to control food production and distribution, and dictating what people could eat. The damage to food quantity and quality took many years to repair, indeed rationing was continued for a decade post-war, and the Min of Ag never gave up the reins of power, later enthusiastically embracing the most extreme lunacies of the European Economic Community/EU. This cast a long shadow on the national diet, which extended into the middle 1980s, an attitude that mass institutional food would be to be mediocre, at best, and we ought not to expect otherwise, despite whatever we experienced in other countries. The best of English cooking was domestic, in those days, especially roasted meats, baked foods, and puddings. Foreigners seldom experienced this because it was essentially private, and, of course, it depended on the specific woman doing the cooking. So I presume that the reason I was fed so much animal offcuts and offal, like oxtails and tongues, hearts, livers, and kidneys, all of which I hated, and flavorless calories such as tapioca and semolina, and little fish in tins, was a communistic mindset that instinctively regarded food as something that was sustenance and fuel for the proletariat, rather than potentially one of the good things in life. And of course the question arises, what was happening to all the good cuts of meat, to the great cuts of an animal's muscles rather than its organs and peripheries? Where was all that going? Who was eating all the good stuff? As nearly always with socialism and leftism generally, the rules and restrictions were for the little people, not for the communist leaders themselves, most of whom have always self-righteous and hypocritical tots. Of course, things have now gone too far the other way. It is boring, wasteful, and life-distorting to regard every meal as an event, to be planned, discussed, photographed and shared online. There is a place for regarding food as routine belly timber. I am happy enough with that. Just so long as my belly timber is not awful. When it comes to phenomena like search engines and AI, we are being strategically manipulated, and this has major life implications. Bruce Charlton. What I find extremely important about things like search engines from the 1990s onward, social media from the mid-2000s, and AI currently, is that, from a high level, we are being manipulated strategically. By strategically, I mean over a time scale of many years. For this to be possible, the manipulation must be done by persons that have access to very large amounts of money. Money and other resources, including the ability to manipulate laws to permit whatever they want to do, to reshape national/multinational policies, and to prevent competition. For instance, the development of the best search engine/S was colossally funded and subsidized, for many years, by invisible, presumably military and intelligence, sources. Many years in which the technology cost a great deal of money, and made no money at all. This is simply not possible without very long-term backing from very wealthy patrons. Then the unique status and power of this search engine was protected by laws and, presumably, other means, so that no superior competitor could emerge or was allowed. Regulations were shaped to allow exemption from all kinds of restrictions that applied to written material, and immunity to laws that had regulated publishers. Income without visible sources. Power without responsibility. And there is a closely analogous situation with respect to social media platforms, and with post-November 2022 AI systems. There was again colossal financial backing and investment for many years, from unknown sources, without visible or remotely commensurate sources of income, adequate income. This transcends any market. The consumers are not customers. With AI, laws have been changed, or tacitly sidelined, to allow industrial-scale plagiarism with immunity from prosecution. The entire electricity generation system of the USA, and energy policy generally, has been reshaped to accommodate AI. And all this must have been known and guaranteed up front, in advance of implementation. So, someone, somewhere, with vast money resources that are not derived from customers, and having the power to make and break laws, is working across a timescale of more than a decade to provide these tools such as search engines, social media platforms and now AI. We don't know who these people are, we don't explicitly know what is their real motivation. But the motivation does not seem to be money, at least not primarily, because these technologies take unimaginably vast amounts of money to develop across long periods before there is any possibility of beginning to recoup expenses, and by then, there will be another, similarly vast project afoot. At the very least, such giga investors must be sure, i.e. totally confident, that they can reshape the laws, national strategies, and media coverage so as to ensure the success of whatever technologies may, or may not, eventually emerge. And this means that the investors in search engines, /social media /AI, essentially rule the world, already. My inference is that they indeed already rule the world, substantially, insofar as it can be ruled, and these technologies are, or were, therefore strategically intended to monitor and control the world. But maybe now the investors are being hoodwinked, and there is a higher level of strategy than this, and that strategy is to destroy the world. Hat tip to a comment by NLR for triggering this post. Truth has two meanings. Francis Berger.
Truth has two meanings. There is truth as knowledge of reality and truth as reality itself. Nikolai Berdyaev, The Beginning and the End.
I return to this observation by Berdyaev over and over again, and it often reminds me of the interaction between Pilate and Jesus as recorded in the fourth Gospel, specifically the part where Jesus declares that everyone on the side of truth listens to him, which then prompts Pilate to respond by asking, "What is truth?" Pilate's response is an expression of truth as knowledge of reality. On the other hand, Jesus' proclamation that he was born and came into the world to testify to the truth falls in line with Berdyev's notion of truth as reality itself. Knowledge of reality is the realm of epistemology, theories of knowledge concerning how, what, and why we know what we know. Truth as reality itself transcends most defined epistemic contacts with reality. It is not merely knowledge of truth as reality but the direct knowledge of truth as reality itself. Knowledge of reality as truth relies on secondary thinking and knowledge. Truth as reality exists entirely in primary thinking and direct knowing. Before encountering Jesus, Pilate existed exclusively in truth as knowledge of reality, as evidenced by his "What is truth?" quip. Yet during his encounter with Jesus, Pilate most surely experienced truth as reality itself, a penetrating albeit fleeting moment of direct knowledge that provided a silent, wordless, yet infinitely deafening response to his quid est veritas. Dostoevsky noted the following in a letter to Madame N. D. von Wisin, written in 1854.
I want to say to you, about myself, that I am a child of this age, a child of unfaith and skepticism, and probably, indeed I know it, shall remain so to the end of my life. How dreadfully has it tormented me, and torments me even now, this longing for faith, which is all the stronger for the proofs I have against it. And yet God gives me sometimes moments of perfect peace. In such moments I love and believe that I am loved. In such moments I have formulated my creed, wherein all is clear and holy to me. This creed is extremely simple. Here it is. I believe that there is nothing lovelier, deeper, more sympathetic, more rational, more manly, and more perfect than the Savior. I say to myself with jealous love that not only is there no one else like him, but that there could be no one. I would even say more. If anyone could prove to me that Christ is outside the truth, and if the truth really did exclude Christ, I should prefer to stay with Christ and not with truth.
Truth as knowledge of reality resides in skepticism and unfaith, in the constant need to question the reality of the divine, and in the yearning to have the divine proved or disproved via some secondary medium or other. Yet as Dostoevsky notes, even if truth as knowledge of reality could exclude Jesus, it would do little to dent truth as reality itself. Direct knowledge of truth as reality itself is not guaranteed in this world. We could live our whole mortal lives without experiencing it once. Yet, this does not matter. What matters is our faith in truth as reality itself. We remain on the side of truth as long as we are open to listening to Jesus, and the possibility of experiencing moments in which we love and believe that we are loved. Moments during which all is clear and holy. The successful totalitarian global coup of 2020 has been breaking up since, but world politics is still totalitarian. Bruce Charlton. In 2020 those with the ability to perceive and learn, realized that we inhabited a totalitarian world, which means an evil world. In other words, our world is rooted in atheist, materialist, leftist assumptions, where all significant social institutions are interlinked and bureaucratically subordinate to this ideology. This is why so many people have politics as their fundamental value, and why so many people behave as if everything is, at root, politics. By politics they means the system of totalitarianism. Everything is politics means that, bottom line, everything in the public realm, discourse and behaviors, communications and actions, is part of this totalitarian system. Since 2020, this unified world government has broken up into two or more increasingly hostile factions, but the components are still totalitarian in their nature. This does not mean that all the totalitarian units are as bad as each other. They aren't. Some, for example ours, are purposively worse than others. Some have hope of becoming better, more socially Christian to be exact, while still ultimately totalitarian. Other factions are actively hostile to Christianity and its legacy. But all factions are bad in the way that totalitarianism is bad, which is a modern way. Post-19th century, totalitarianism is only possible in a post-religious society, with highly developed and pervasive bureaucracy and mass media. What this means for religion is that all churches are part of the totalitarian system. Therefore, insofar as churches are this worldly institutions, churches are net atheist, materialist, leftist, and overall part of the problem of institutional evil. This implies that church-led Christianity will, overall and by net effect, be totalitarian, hence anti-Christian. And so will church-rooted Christian people. Against this, and because of the nature of evil and its progression, there is an accelerating trend for the ubiquitous totalitarian societies strategically to self-destruct. The most evil parts of totalitarianism are those that are most pervasively and strategically orientated towards destruction in many forms, such as destroying nature, the environment, functionality, within and between social systems, i.e. destroying science, law, education, etc., agriculture, the health and lives of masses of people, and so on and so forth, right across the board. Destruction is not an explicit goal, however, except, presumably, at the power level above global totalitarianism, but instead totalitarian subgroups are manipulated into mutual and internal destruction by their ideologies of opposition/negation and value inversion. The totalitarians are therefore induced by their ideological assumptions into incoherent sub-strategies that accomplish the opposite of stated goals, and lead always to accelerated destruction. So, we find ourselves in a world where politics is everything, hence everything is politics, yet consequently politics is all evil, and political discourse is a clash between totalitarianisms. It is extremely tempting to be drawn into politics, precisely because it is all pervasive in functional discourse. This ubiquity makes it seem that politics, debate, analysis, choice, action etc., is fundamental and necessary. From inside the system, anyone who refuses to share the assumption that politics is primary and everything is seen as shirking ultimate responsibility. Therefore we find, on the one hand, an expressed cynicism at politics, on the other hand, in practice, politics matters more to most people than anything else. Politics usually forms the basis of a person's worldview, and typically shapes all their other convictions and choices, including religious. Under totalitarianism, religion becomes primarily and mandatorily political, both in the mainstream and in dissenting groups. Thus, subjectively, my life, myself, seem inescapably captured by the system, and the only way out seems to be political, a politics to end all politics, perhaps. My point is that we default to political discourse and convictions. Under totalitarianism, politics seems more important than anything, and more important than ever. But there is no hope in this. Spiritually, we must break out from the loop, which means we first need to disengage sufficiently to understand the nature of our situation. This understanding of our situation is the first and necessary step, and it is spiritually valuable in itself. What happens after understanding is mainly a choice of affiliation, and when all the options in this world are evil by nature, then a Christian affiliation must be out with this world. To me, this seems the only good way to escape from and subordinate the totalitarianism of politics is everything. Following Jesus, literally. Bruce Charlton. As readers may know, I feel a need to understand Christianity so simply and clearly that it can be grasped as a whole, by a single act of thinking. I have previously explained what Jesus meant in the fourth Gospel, John, when he requires people to follow him, and I explained it in terms of the Good Shepherd leading his sheep from the front. I have also explained following in terms of us meeting Jesus post-mortally and being led by him through the process of resurrection into heaven. It now seems to me that Jesus might have meant by following, something even simpler and clearer because more literal. We are enjoined to follow Jesus where he went. That is, if we want resurrected eternal life, we should follow Jesus to heaven. That is, we should follow Jesus through the process of resurrection to get to that place or state of heaven. But the main thing is to follow Jesus to heaven. And we do that by wanting it. By wanting heaven more than we want anything else, so that we will do whatever is needful to get there, what is needful to achieve heaven, and we will know what that is, when the time is right. Following Jesus to heaven is something we do after death, just as Jesus went to heaven after his death. Here and now, what is required, is to be known in the context of having decided that we want to follow Jesus to heaven. How we personally should live, is in expectation of following Jesus to heaven. Plus, note, following is not therefore meant as instructions to follow a specific path or rules, nor modeling our life on Jesus's life, nor a matter of following any purported intermediary such as membership, words, rituals or symbols. In the past it was different since men in those days were groupish by nature, and responded spontaneously in the right way to words, symbols, rituals. For us, here and now, we must follow Jesus specifically and personally, or, probably, we won't be following him at all. The magic of human institutions, now absent, once always present, but never wholly sufficient. Bruce Charlton. For most of recorded history until recently, many human institutions, organizations, formal groupings, were magical, to some degree. The further back we go, the more magical they could be. The earlier in our life we go, the more likely that we would ourselves experience this magic. However, there were also not magical groupings, and, no matter how magical the institution, there have always been those people who do not participate in it, being either immune to that magic, or susceptible but reject it. Furthermore, the innate magic of pre-adolescent childhood, means that, even now, groupings of such children often have a strongly magical ambience. The big difference across the generations relates to adult institutions, which used often to have a significant magical quality, but now are likely to be, almost entirely, soulless, dead, mechanical, and indeed purposively anti-magical. Zealous in their active destruction of any such qualities, typically by means of abstract and generic systems of bureaucracy and computerization. For instance, many educational institutions used to be strongly magical in their nature. This applied especially to small and localized institutions, or those with a mutually selective character, i.e. both selected and selecting. Through my adult life I experienced educational institutions with considerable variations in the magical qualities, although I was also aware that most people were not consciously aware of such differences even when they spontaneously responded to them. Most people would speak against the reality and significance of such institutional aspects, and would cheerfully erode or eliminate magical aspects whenever this seemed expedient, from abstract ideology, or sometimes from sheer resentment-driven spite. Looking back, I could see that this institutional magic had, overall, been both more pervasive and common, and stronger, at least potentially stronger, the further back one went. Yet institutional enchantment was never complete. Human life was always and for everybody to some degree, marred by the mundane, this being the nature of our mortal state. The magic of institutions was therefore at its height, as I understand it, probably the major source of enchantment in human existence, while at the same time the very nature of institutions, plus the human beings who constitute them, meant that this magical quality was always both incomplete and contradicted. And, through my adult life, from the 1980s, I could also see that this magic was innately ebbing, while also being purposively expunged, from the educational institutions of which I knew. The difference across the decades was extreme. In my childhood and early adulthood, the magical quality of, for instance, universities was, to me, palpable. By the time I retired from academia, the magic had been very completely destroyed. Perhaps most evident when a soulless, and indeed actively soul-destroying, institution would attempt to cloak itself in the enchanted mantle of earlier generations. This would dishonestly be attempted using the mind-manipulating procedures of modern advertising and public relations, and would therefore fail to attain magic, but reduce enchantment to ideology, false promises of hedonism, fashion, and covert appeals to status snobbery. While I devoted considerable energy to fighting this anti-magical trend, I now believe that a decline of that kind of spontaneous, largely unconscious, institutional magic was inevitable, due to the innate developments of human consciousness. When the human beings of an institution themselves come to lack spontaneous and unconscious magic, then enchantment is bound to wane from all institutions. The analogy with adolescence, nowadays, is close. Many children are spontaneously and unconsciously susceptible to enchantment, but the innate process of adolescence will abolish this, after which the capacity to know and live magically must be the consequence of a conscious choice. In the later 20th century, Western adults reached an adolescence of consciousness, so that spontaneous and unconscious magic receded, and if we were to continue to live any kind of enchanted life in our institutions, magic would need explicitly to be acknowledged as good, and purposively pursued. In sum, as we approached the millennium, magic needed to become self-conscious and consciously valued, or else there would soon be no magic. We know by now which of these happened. So complete has become the disenchantment of institutions, that, it seems, most people deny that things ever were otherwise. Most people assume that all institutions were always as they are now, spiritually dead, exploitatively manipulative, habitually dishonest. But such retrospective denigration is projection of our evil onto others, as can be seen if historical sources are experienced sympathetically. From where we actually are, I find it hard even to imagine how institutions can be re-enchanted, because there is neither recognition of the problem, nor will to solve it. Furthermore, I am pretty sure that, from now, institutional re-enchantment can happen only on the basis of Jesus Christ. Yet this needs to happen in a context where the churches are themselves very thoroughly disenchanted, including by assimilation into the ideological materialism of totalitarian bureaucracy. This means that any future source of enchantment must primarily, i.e. as a first step, be sought out with the Christian church institutions, and Christianity, plus/minus specific churches, regenerated from that basis. From the spiritual place we now inhabit and the people we actually are, I cannot see any way that a Christianity rooted primarily in institutional affiliation, to any kind of institution, no matter how idealized, can succeed in doing what needs to be done. On the other side, the attempt to do without enchantment, to construct a religion that operates at the level of institutional power, rooted in the mundane, rational, functional, for example a religion designed to implement a particular kind of society, well, this will surely fail. Fail because it will inevitably assimilate to the existing mundane, pseudo-rational, quasi-functionality of that system of totalitarianism that characterizes our civilization. With men as we are, any possible church-based, institutionally rooted Christianity will be secular and materialistic, totalitarian, and political, and spiritually dead. The only path ahead, is the right path ahead. Magic does not mean good, since there is black magic, intended to manipulate people and creation, as well as white, in harmony with God and creation. But magic is of itself good, in the sense that it recognizes the reality of our participation in creation, and by enchantment we are aware of this participation. Whereas the exclusion or elimination of magic is intrinsically an evil because rooted in falsehood, and the intent to cause spiritual harm. Islam in the West. William Wildblood. History tells us that Islam cannot coexist with Christianity or anything else for that matter. It must either dominate or it must work towards dominating. This has been forgotten by most secular governments in the West over the last few decades, but it is becoming a matter of increasing significance, so I reproduce here what was going to be a chapter in my forthcoming book, A Survival Guide to the End Times. I cut it out due to its peripheral relevance to the theme of the book, but it is hardly irrelevant in terms of where we are today in the Western world. Some of it has already featured here in previous posts, but here it is all in one place. I was flipping through The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis recently, a book I first read many years ago, and had forgotten about. It's a short work, based on lectures he gave in 1943, and is not overtly religious in theme, even though it is in essence. What it does is defend universal spiritual values against the contemporary assault on them, specifically in the field of education, which denied that moral and aesthetic values were grounded in something objective. It was the beginning of the moral relativism, now so firmly established, which dismisses the idea that there are universal truths which are rooted in an absolute reality. Lewis argues for what he calls in this book the Tao, which for him is something like Maut in ancient Egypt, or just objective reality, the foundation truth of the universe and of being in general. The Tao is not provable by materialistic, rational, intellectual, logical or scientific means, because it derives from a ground much deeper than can be accessed by these on their own. It is recognized, known, accepted, seen, or not by the spiritually blind, but it is not verifiable by empirical evidence as that phrase is normally understood. It should be self-evident but cannot be proved by any of the ways materialists demand proof. At the end of these lectures, Lewis provides a compendium of sayings illustrative of natural law drawn from many different sources and traditions ranging from Egyptian, Roman, Greek and Chinese to Christian, Hindu and Jewish to Norse, Anglo-Saxon, Babylonian, Native American and even Australian Aborigine. But there is nothing from Islam. This might seem a strange oversight, but it reminded me of the time I first became interested in spiritual matters and studied scriptures from all the main traditions. I knew the Bible reasonably well, but reread the Gospels in the light of my newfound interests and beliefs. I read Hindu and Buddhist scriptures, Plato, the classics of Taoism and Zen, and some collections of wise words like Lewis's compendium. All these spoke of mystical understanding, perhaps in different ways and on different levels, and some more than others, but they all had an insight into higher reality. Then I read the Quran expecting to find more of the same. What a disappointment! There was nothing here that approached the profundity of other scriptures. It barely reached the level of Old Testament spiritual understanding, never mind the New Testament. It was clear that the compiler of this text, which seemed rather like a New Age type channeling, albeit in the context of its time and place, was nowhere near the spiritual level of the founders of other religions. Now, maybe these teachings were a step forward for the people of that time and place, but they have little to say to us today, unlike other scriptures which can transcend time and place and still speak to us across the centuries. It is often said that the three monotheistic religions worship the same God. However, they approach him in such different ways that this is hard to maintain in any seriousness. For the Christian, God is a loving Father, but the God depicted in this holy book demands total allegiance as a despot does from a slave. He may be a benign despot if you obey him, but he leaves no room for you as a free individual. I'm not disputing there have been many pious worshippers of God in this religion, but there are also encouragements to violence and, though these are often glossed over and excused by believers, they are plainly there in the source texts and recorded sayings of its founder, who was a war leader as much as he was a prophet. Not all Muslims are active extremists, of course, but the extremism in Islam is fundamental to it. It is not a distortion of it but an integral part. The West used to know that, and from hard-won experience. If the modernist ethos of relativism, as described by C.S. Lewis, is one way of abolishing man, so too is an absolutist religion which gives all power to the deity and leaves no freedom for the individual human soul. It must obey. It must submit. It's in the name, after all. But God does not want obedience. He wants love. If Islam were just a religion, it would still be a simplification of more profound teachings, but it would not be a problem for those outside the circle of the faithful. However, it is not just a religion. It aims to encompass every aspect of life, leaving nothing to the individual human being whose only task is to submit. As a result, there is no separation between religion and politics. There is not a religious version of this religion and a political one. These are two aspects of the same thing. Christ said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's," drawing a clear distinction between the spiritual and temporal aspects of life. But for the Muslim, God is Caesar, and the effect of that is to reduce the human to nothing, stripping him of proper agency, creative potential and freedom. Islam must dominate every single aspect of the life of its believers, not just the spiritual but the political and social too. It even forbids certain forms of artistic expression which you might think a good idea, seeing where complete freedom in that regard has got us to in the West over the last century, but the result in this case has been spiritually crippling, not ennobling. To be sure, Islam has produced some beautiful architecture and design and poetry, but these are often in spite of it, not inspired by it. The fact that it is forbidden to show the human form is very revealing. It demonstrates that humanity is effectively banned. For the Christian, God is revealed in the human form, but in Islam he remains totally transcendent and cannot be approached except in a servile way. The Muslim faithful are under instruction to convert everyone to their cause and not to rest until they have done so. Islam is not willing to share power and will accommodate itself to its perceived rivals in the short term only for long-term advantage. That has been demonstrated historically repeatedly. Muslims are even authorized to lie and deceive to this end if that is to the unbeliever. That is regarded as a virtuous act, and history shows that they will go along with their hosts when in a minority only to enforce their will when their numbers are sufficient. It is naive to ignore this reality, and yet that is just what the West has been doing. What is the solution to this problem, since problem it is and one that will get worse? From the point of view of the West, it is to recognize the reality of the situation. These believers believe in their religion, and they will obey its diktats, so we should know what these are. For the believers themselves, the way forward is through religious reform. Their focus on prayer is commendable, but they must abandon those aspects of their religion that may have been appropriate 1,300 years ago but are not now. Actually, they weren't then either. If you have any understanding of the way God works, you will know that his aim is to bring us up, not to crystallize us in ways of the past but to spiritualize our understanding. Therefore, these believers need to pay attention to the mystical path of their religion, to Sufism, for God has sent them this to remedy foundational mistakes. The letter kills but the spirit gives life. This is the primary lesson the followers of Islam need to learn. If the modern world demonstrates the tragic results of banishing God from the world and giving supreme power and authority to man, then Islam has the opposite problem. That may tempt some people to see it as a solution to the problems of modernity. In fact, as opposites reflect each other, it is equally flawed, just in a different way. The only real solution is to see God and man as partners working together creatively, though God, of course, remains God. And where do we see this brought to perfection? In Christ, God made man. Some people would say that any religion is better than none. Any acknowledgement of God is better than rejecting Him. I would say, it depends. For one thing, it depends on what sort of God you follow. What are His demands and expectations? How does He frame the good? There are many excellent practices in Islam, such as faith in God, prayer, almsgiving, fasting, pilgrimage, the 5 pillars. These are undoubtedly beneficial to the soul, turning it away from worldly preoccupation and towards the spiritual world. But in the form in which they are presented and followed, they are good for souls who need strict external guidance. They become restrictive for souls who are beginning to take spiritual responsibility for themselves. Sufism was provided for such souls, but it never really established itself other than on the peripheries of the Muslim world, and was often condemned by the mainstream as heretical, the strong influence of Vedanta being too much to accept. If Islam is to become a positive force in the world, it must change. It remains too intellectually and morally one-dimensional, and can only function as a rigid system for people who have not yet separated from the herd. Then it must renounce its political and territorial ambitions and its religious exclusivism. Like Marxism, it is a totalitarian ideology that demands complete control and absolute authority. It has sought to propagate itself through violence, but must abandon that aspect of its supposed mission and stick to the 5 pillars. But even these 5 pillars must be seen in a different light, as signposts to inner understanding rather than rules and regulations to be followed without thought. In religion there is an outer path and an inner path. Islam has always given the outer path even more importance than most other religions, and goodness knows this is a fault common to them all. Islam was born in warfare and spread through the sword. This aspect of its heritage must be renounced if it is to serve the will of God, which will be difficult because it will mean a radical reinterpretation of its core beliefs and an acceptance that its prophet was not the perfect image of a man they say he was. Jesus may have said he did not come to bring peace but a sword, but quite obviously he meant by this the sword of truth, which separates truth from lies, good from evil, love from hate. He also said those who live by the sword, die by the sword. Unfortunately, it is the second usage that Islam has followed. In the days when I studied the various mystical traditions, I found Sufism one of the most interesting, full of insight and including many souls of great spiritual authority. Sufism contains the inner principles behind Islam and interprets the simplistic injunctions of the Quran on a genuinely spiritual level. Muslims who wish to be closer to the guiding impulse behind their faith should explore Sufi teachings more deeply. They should also know that Islam is not and never was intended for the West. Those who try to enforce it on Western countries are not doing the will of God but going directly against it. The principles of Islam are opposed to those of the West, which are to do with freedom and individuality. Freedom and individuality in God, but freedom and individuality all the same. Islam denies both. It certainly cannot save the West. I was recently asked why Christianity is better than Islam by a young man, some of whose friends had decided that if they were going to follow a religion, then Islam seemed a more attractive proposition than Christianity, as it had a greater sense of where it stood on issues and didn't prevaricate or sentimentalize, which Christianity in its official forms now does. On the face of it, it's hard to disagree with this view. Islam is firm in its beliefs and doesn't seek to accommodate itself to the secular world, which modern Christianity often does, as its leaders try to justify their existence by pandering to social changes. Also, Islam has not become feminized, which Christianity along with the whole Western world has, and this appeals to younger men who see in feminism a civilization-destroying influence. However, whilst it is true that many Christian churches have succumbed to the world and replaced the spiritual with the anodyne charms of secular humanism, Islam never had much connection with the spiritual to begin with. It has a view of God based on primitive conceptions of the deity, and is unable to open itself up to higher dimensions of being. Its virtue that it doesn't change is also a major weakness. It is stuck in the past, unable to evolve as consciousness does. This inflexibility might be regarded as a positive, but the rights and wrongs of inflexibility depend on what refuses to change. Islam may have been a corrective for polytheistic pagans in a 7th century of warring tribes, but it has nothing to say to a 21st century consciousness. But the best answer to this question is to rephrase it and ask, why is Christ better than Muhammad? And even a casual look at the lives of these two teachers shows the gulf between them in terms of spiritual understanding. They both spoke of the one God, but for Jesus he was a loving father, while for Muhammad he was more like an over-promoted tribal deity who demanded absolute allegiance. And so, while Christianity is based on love, Islam is based on law. Further, as we have already pointed out, Christianity is grounded in freedom, whereas Islam demands obedience. This is illustrated in the postures for prayer of the two religions. A Christian kneels in humility, but his back is straight. The full prostration of a Muslim in prayer also shows humility, but it is more that of a slave before its master than a free individual. I have not even spoken of the fact that Jesus was the Son of God who healed the spiritual damage caused by the fall, while Muhammad, even in the eyes of his own followers, was no more than a prophet, and one who just mixed and matched from Jewish and Christian sources. He brought nothing new, whereas Jesus showed us the way to become sons of God ourselves. See John 14:12. Whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these. At best, Muhammad was a messenger, while Jesus was a window into heaven. In fact, not just a window. He was and is a doorway. Mentioning heaven brings us to another critical difference. Is the Muslim paradise the same as the Christian heaven? Hardly, since one is the perfection of earthly existence while the other is the total transformation of being. When you understand that the next world has many planes of existence, you see that the paradise of Islam is what is known as the wish fulfillment plane, where all your desires are fulfilled, but only to the extent that allows for the exteriorization of your earthly wishes without the impediment of matter. Your mind can create palaces and gardens insofar as you conceive of such things, but this is still no more than this world brought to what you think of as an ideal state. You remain limited by the narrowness of your own vision, whereas in the true heaven of Christ you are freed from the boundaries of your circumscribed self. The Islamic paradise gives the lower self what it wants, but heaven is entry into the glorified existence of higher being. Doubtless many nominal Christians will go to a place that is a Christian version of paradise on the astral plane, as the psychic world is also known, but that is due to their deficiencies, not those of their religion. The fact is, Jesus and Muhammad promised their followers completely different destinations. They spoke from completely different spiritual perspectives. Soft totalitarianism in the Third Reich, or how many Germans did it take to control 3 million Danes? Bruce Charlton. During World War II, the Third Reich invaded and occupied Denmark, and for the first few years, circa 1940–43, this was a classic example of what people nowadays call soft totalitarianism, meaning totalitarianism imposed without use of violent coercion. Denmark had a population of about 3 million, so how many Germans do you think were needed to control this population? The answer from military historian Roland White's recent book, Mosquito, The Extraordinary True Story of the Legendary RAF Aircraft, is 89. That is 89. Averaging one German to administer more than 30,000 Danes. I found this very interesting, given that the Third Reich has, for obvious reasons, become a byword for the most purposively aggressive and physical form of totalitarianism. Of course, the handful of Germans were backed by the threat of German military might and the rest of it, yet the numbers tell us that the imposition of totalitarian rule, even during a world war, can be and was accomplished by soft methods. Presumably some mixture of factors such as effective ideological propaganda, tacit support of the regime, and the calculations of fear and expediency in a situation where there is no alternative and resistance is futile. The value of this insight is that most people doubt that we of the West inhabit a totalitarian system of governance, because we do not see the apparatus of violent physical coercion that we have been taught is a necessary feature of such politics. Yet, the example of Denmark proves that rigorous and efficient soft totalitarian rule is possible, and effective, at least, for a few years, by a tiny number of alien controllers, combined with the cooperation, or collaboration, of sufficient natives of the national leadership class, and the tacit consent of the bulk of the remainder. It also seems to prove that totalitarianism works best when it is soft, when it deploys soft ideas rather than hard violence. How many outsiders does it take to rule a UK of 60 million? Does it just scale up proportionately to a couple of thousand aliens? Or are the economies of scale and fewer than 2k aliens are needed? Or do the difficulties multiply exponentially and maybe tens of thousands are needed? Either way, it is salutary to realize that a thoroughly totalitarian system need not deploy large numbers of external rulers, nor physical coercion, to be a very complete and effective mechanism of mass control. And of course, this is exactly what we find, here and now, could we but recognize it. Note, Roland White's books tells a story of how this peaceful state of soft totalitarianism was deliberately subverted by British military intelligence by developing a sabotage network, that eventually grew to provoke violent German reprisals, and hard totalitarianism, which led to much greater Danish resistance, and the intended transfer of many more German personnel and resources to control Denmark. This effective intervention by another alien power, i.e. the UK, is also a demonstration of how a very few people who want to destabilize a system by guerrilla methods, can do so. The whole narrative seems to me one of elite external powers manipulating the Danish masses for their own ends. Evidence depends on theory, theory depends on assumptions. Bruce Charlton. Evidence depends on theory, theory depends on assumptions. So, he who controls our fundamental assumptions concerning the nature of reality, controls everything that ultimately matters. Just a reformulation of an old thought. We live in a world of public discourse that pretends to be determined by evidence, but evidence is not determinative, and cannot be. Because what counts as evidence, and what an item of evidence means, is dependent on theory. And all theories depend on assumptions concerning the nature of reality. So that our assumptions concerning the nature of reality, i.e. metaphysics, determine all knowledge. And this is why totalitarian, materialist, atheism rules the world of public discourse, why all evidence seems to support it, and why there seems to be no evidence to support the spirit and the divine. It is why all serious theories acknowledged in public discourse lead in circles back to themselves, why there is no alternative and resistance is futile. It is why all discussion of purpose, meaning and personal significance seem arbitrary and feeble, and why hedonism, nihilism and despair are the pervasive moods of modernity. Purpose, meaning, and the significance of the individual person are all excluded from the accepted and propagated picture of the nature of reality in this life and universe. For us, the ultimate assumptions of real reality are of abstract impersonal particles, forces, processes, fields, energies, randomness. Operating unknown and mechanically, algorithmically, in a world without consciousness, or life. These assumptions are built into our public life, our pubic institutions, and from such ultimate metaphysical assumptions, any purpose, meaning, personal significance is arbitrary. Even for the self-identified religious, the purposeless, meaningless universe, indifferent to life and men, is the real picture, much realer than that of God. Indeed, God is regarded as having primarily created such a dead and futile world, without values, only later inserting some living beings, and finally humans. So, according to the mainstream and institutional reality, the purposeless, meaningless, impersonal world came first, and existed without our consciousness. By this we know which is most fundamental, which is most important, and is not us. Thus the assumptions of our underlying metaphysical picture combine to rule out the primacy and seriousness of purpose, meaning, personal significance, and values in the universe, and in our societies and individual lives. These are not regarded as fundamental, but merely optional extras, even for the religious. Public debate and discussions about evidence or theories relating to God, creation, good and evil, etc., are all rendered necessarily trivial. Our motivations are poisoned at source. Those who controls our fundamental assumptions, control everything that ultimately matters. This is one reason why the alternative internet makes no substantive difference, why those political animals who regard themselves as opposed to mainstream leftism make no difference, why even the most serious types of institutional religion make no difference. Dig down, and they share the same deep assumptions as the globalist totalitarians, such that dissent is merely superficial, and ultimately irrelevant. One heaven, many hells. Bruce Charlton. There is one heaven, the second creation that we inhabit by following Jesus Christ through resurrection to eternal life. But it is not a homogeneous heaven, almost the opposite. Heaven is unified by love, every inhabitant lives only by love. That means that heaven contains as much variety as there are inhabitants. Every new person who ascends to heaven adds to its variety. Some people, including Mormons, conceptualize heaven as subdivided, or having many mansions. That's not it, because it implies restrictions upon the saved, among the resurrected. And it is wrong insofar as it implies any homogeneity among the inhabitants of heaven's supposed subdivisions. But there are many hells, in fact, they can't really be numbered. Hell is not a place, but wherever there is anyone, or any group, who oppose divine creation. Only insofar as there is cooperation among those who oppose divine creation could there be said to be one hell. However, members of hell are unified only by their hatred of God. What they want is selfish, so there is endemic latent conflict within and between all hells. Hells are all in this world, all in the primary creation that you and I currently inhabit. Those in heaven can go where they please, including this world, and any of the hells in it. Heaven is barred against all inhabitants of hell, unless they repent, and follow Jesus to resurrected eternal life. If they can't or won't repent and love, they will not experience heaven. Only those who have made an eternal commitment to live only by love, can be in heaven. And that is one heaven. We can think of heaven as like an ideal extended family. Every member is different in abilities and interests, and are at different stages of maturity, and indeed members each have personal preferences among the family. But just one family. Occult and esoteric, what do they mean? How to approach them? Bruce Charlton. Occult means hidden, and often refers to hidden knowledge. Typically, this is knowledge that has been kept secret, for example by being sustained in a closed society, or perhaps knowledge encoded, so that only those who know the code can discover it. But hidden knowledge may instead be clear and simple, not secret but instead hidden in plain sight, not encoded but simply ignored by the majority. Ignored perhaps because it is no interest, in some way unwelcome, opening a can of worms they'd rather not deal with, or indeed so clear and so simple, that most people regard it as necessarily wrong. because the knowledge strikes them as embarrassingly childish and simplistic. Esoteric means for the few, and mostly refers to groups to human societies. The term often refers to exclusive groups characterized by rigorous selection and prolonged training, and typically includes groups that claim to possess secret occult knowledge or the keys to understand encoded occult knowledge. But, analogously with the possible meanings of occult, esoteric groups for the few as such are not confined to the holders of occult knowledge, but characterize almost many types of functional human institution, such as some universities or colleges, and legal and medical professions, and these also implicitly claim to possess occult knowledge which is not understandable except by those who are trained, and have the keys. More significantly, there is the question of why some groups are for the few, which might be because only few regard the matter as real and important, or who have an active interest. An esoteric grouping may happen, or be attempted, because the many are indifferent or hostile to the subject. When the majority believe that which is false, and are evil affiliated, then the possibility of allying with good is necessarily restricted to the few, or even to a single person. When it comes to evaluating occult knowledge or esoteric groups, it seems evident that the terms are descriptive rather than intrinsically evaluative. As usual, the valuation depends primarily on matters such as purposes and motivations, and whether these are on the side of God and creation, or against them. Whether the real and underlying motivation is for this worldly power, wealth, sex, success and the like, or to manipulate others and nature. Or instead to seek potentially good aligned goals such as self-knowledge, experiential understanding of reality, encouragement in pursuit of salvation etc. It seems to me that, as of 2025, in the West, most of the people who are explicitly involved in esoteric groups and engaged with occult knowledge are badly motivated. They are on the wrong side of the spiritual war of this world. But the same applies to most Christians, and to most Christians in any particular church or denominations. They are badly motivated. That is, most self-identified Christians are, overall, on the side that opposes God in the spiritual war. In this mixed world, by its very nature, all men are sinners, all groups are corrupted and all knowledge is impure. It is not our task to attempt the impossible of redeeming, or even reforming, the world, but to navigate our way through our life by discernment and in accordance with our intuition and divine guidance, as we desire and commit to following Jesus Christ. This may, and it seems likely, given the nature of the world, en masse, here and now, lead us at some point to some degree of engagement with explicit or implicitly occult knowledge and the esoteric. So be it. Note, the above was stimulated by rereading Gareth Knight's biography of his great friend the Reverend Canon Father Anthony Duncan, Christ and Kabbalah, or, The Mind in the Heart, 2013. Appeals to moderation are always futile. Bruce Charlton. When someone is extreme, in whatever direction, then appeals to be moderate, to take a middle path, are futile. Think about it, there are an infinite number of possible points between extremes. On what principle should we choose that point at which we are moderate? Presumably it isn't always necessarily halfway between extremes, but even if it was, what does that actually mean? Some kind of dilution of each extreme, somehow combined. Or some kind of 50-50 alternation between the extremes. Or what? In practice, the appeal for moderation is a negative recognition that neither option on offer, by extremists is desirable, but no alternative principle is being suggested. The appeal to moderation is therefore an acceptance of the theoretical framework of the extremes, which is why it is always futile. And why, insofar as anyone really is motivated by moderation, their motivation is always weak. There is no such thing as a courageous moderate. So long as the theoretical framework is intact, then the extremes will carry the greatest authority, And no matter how well motivated, moderation will be understood as an unprincipled and incoherent, hence feeble and pragmatic, compromise. The real answer is never moderation or a middle way, but some higher principle, some framework that stands above, transcends, and contains the worldviews of the extremes.